Mr. Snowden.
Oh boy.
Thank you for coming today. My name's Tara DeSisto. I am Vice President of Strategic Partnerships for the Libertarian Policy Institute. And I would like to first introduce one of our candidates, one of our wonderful candidates that's running for public office in the state of Massachusetts. Dr. Peter Everett is running for Lieutenant Governor. And he's a huge Ed Snowden fan, so please, Dr. Everett.
Thank you, Tara. So as Tara said, I'm Peter Everett. I'm running for Lieutenant Governor with my friend, Mr. Kevin Reed, our candidate for Governor of Massachusetts. It is my great honor and privilege to introduce this morning's speaker. I also want to thank Professor George Phillies of Massachusetts, who worked with the Libertarian Policy Institute to make this presentation possible. As a medical oncologist, I deal in hard truths, life-altering truths. Because only by discovering the truth, speaking the truth, confronting the truth, can we begin the work of healing. And only in the light of the truth can we find our way. But what if you are told that the truth is forbidden? Then the problem festers, it grows, it consumes us, and we never even learn why. In the past, my field of medicine sometimes traded honesty for paternalism. Maybe if you don't tell grandpa he has cancer, he won't feel as bad. I like to think we live in a more enlightened time today. And maybe if you don't tell the American people that the Fourth Amendment is being fed to the biggest shredder of privacy rights ever constructed, they will feel safer. Edward Snowden needs little introduction to a libertarian audience. He is a former intelligence officer who served in the CIA, NSA, DIA, for nearly a decade on technology and cybersecurity. From inside the machinery of the surveillance state, he saw the American people were being lied to. He saw our elected representatives were being lied to. He saw that the law was being violated on an industrial scale, made possible only by the technology of the information age. So in 2013, he revealed the extent of the US government's illegal and warrantless mass surveillance programs. He warned us at enormous personal cost. He could have stopped there and lived as a fugitive in hiding, like Satoshi Nakamoto or Deep Throat, for those of us who are older. But instead, he has found a way to continue in the cause of liberty. Not as some mysterious stranger, but as an authentic American patriot, public intellectual, and friend of liberty everywhere. A presidential pardon for Edward Snowden is long overdue. I can safely say that if a libertarian were elected president, that pardon would happen on the first day. But there's more. Edward Snowden had the courage to leave behind his home, his friends, his country, and take refuge in a strange foreign place. And in the 9 years since 2013, the threats Mr. Snowden warned us about have only grown. In 2014, he joined the board of the Freedom of the Press Foundation, where he now serves as president. He has continued the work of protecting the values of a free and open society by helping create new tools for communication between the people and the press, so that violations of human rights can now be reported not just in the United States, but worldwide. Please give a libertarian welcome to one of my heroes, Edward Snowden.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So, I'm not sure you guys can hear me. I'm going to trust that you can. Because, unfortunately, I couldn't be there in person. But I'm not going to talk exclusively about the Fourth Amendment today. We have limited time, and I'll try to go as quickly as I can. But there's a lot going on that's transformational and that I think is important to distinguish what's happening amongst the libertarian audience and what's happening more broadly in the general public. When you look at what's happened in the last years, the things that I'm known for, mass surveillance, the rise of a more authoritarian, militaristic, police-oriented state, and what we have now, I think what we see is we see a array of gates being ordered around us, where things that in the past would have been a choice are no longer being made to be a choice, because these routes that we all depend on are being controlled. Now, this is really interesting, I think, in the libertarian mindset, because, of course, property rights are really central to it, and there's this idea of sort of my way or the highway. But what happens when the highway that we're talking about is the public commons? What happens if it is sort of the artery through which we must all pass, and we are told that we are sort of being represented, that our voice is being heard, that we have a vote, but our votes are being diluted, our voices are being hidden, our influence, our impact is being suppressed to the point that a nominally representative system is not representative in fact. When you look at the political system as it exists today, the way gerrymandering and everything is happening, when you look at the routine use of emergency measures, emergency laws, must-pass legislation, what I think we see is we see a suppression of the public voice. I think we see a suppression of the public interest and a replacement of that with something much worse. I'll get into that a little bit later. But what I want to get back to is what we've lost, which is this idea, and I think what libertarians recognize. This is, congratulations, by the way, on your 50th anniversary. Okay. Now I know you can hear me because the cheer was so loud. I want to say freedom implies choice. It implies agency. It implies self-direction. At the same time we do that, we're struggling with a world that is trying to scale. And the response of the institutions that exist today is to try to order the world in such a way that it scales comfortably, it scales easily, it scales frictionlessly. The question that's not asked is, for whom? And I think the problem is that institutions are doing very well. The general public, the average person, you sitting there listening right now, who made an effort to come out here to be a part of something, to try to do something, the people who are in comfortable positions will remain in comfortable positions. But just like a game of musical chairs for the rest of us, every round of play, we lose more chairs. And there's not a lot of concern for what's happening to those people. Now, the idea is in order to pass through these gates, to engage in society, to cast your vote, to do whatever, you have to be granted permission. Now, what does that really mean? We all know, somebody stamps off, it's okay, you can do this. But think about the word at a more structural level. The etymology of the word permission is, so elementary that it's invisible to us. The prefix per in permission means through, as in to perspire, to breathe through our skin, where things pervade, or they permeate, or they perforate. And the latter half of that word, the mission, you might recall elsewhere, as in classic cases that evoke the sense of movement that it symbolizes most clearly, transmission, or emission on these slightly more poetic and darker invocation from the wonderful gentleman who spoke to introduce me here. In the medical context, the return to silence of remission. And I think most centrally to the political context as we see it today, the origin of submission. Move yourself beneath. Now, the two halves of this word permission originally mean movement beyond. Yet in this modern application of the word, we're talking about the exclusion of movement, or more precisely of possibility, the limitation of agency. Now, that movement beyond in the ancient world of today, beyond what are we moving? And these are those gates that I mentioned before. Where did they come from? Who placed them there? That gate, the ability, the authority to indulge or deny our collective human impulse to adventure, is the avatar of modern government. I would say more purely the modern state. This is what makes a state a state, is to apply this authority as widely, as broadly, as publicly, as obviously as they can. And I think that impulse, that governing impulse that has become a popular impulse, that has become the omnipresent sort of symbol of government or being in a well-ordered society today, stands in opposition to the natural or unpermissioned state, which we call liberty. At its core, all of our myths and poetry adorning the language of liberty struggle in my mind to communicate that fundamental meaning of it: freedom from permission. That is what liberty is. It is the ability to act without asking, to speak and to write, to do and to be yourself without getting a paper stamped, without submitting yourself and the completed form alongside it to some central authority, to some higher being, right? And I'm afraid that many of us, particularly who are more interested in this style of thinking, have forgotten that the only intended limitation on liberty is the protection of liberty for others. And this brings us back to that idea of consent and the gates and who runs the gates, right? Whoever you are that's listening to this, I want you to think about the broken system that you see in the world today, and what you see happening across this broken planet. And ask yourself, did you agree to this? If we live in a democracy, if we belong to a sort of representative state, does this represent your will, your family, your community, even your state? And lawmakers that sort of comprise the majority of the sort of binary super party today, they would say it doesn't matter, right? The police would say that you don't have a choice, the law is the law. And Facebook would say that you actually did consent. But I don't think you did, and not in any way that matters, it's material. The reality is today they pretend that we consent. They pretend that we agree because of where we were born, or because of where we had no choice but to live, or simply because we had to click OK to continue when we opened our phone, when we sort of took it out of the box the first time. You can't use it. You have to go through all of the rigor. You have to sort of click all the buttons, scroll all the way to the bottom, that end user licensing agreement. They call it click wrap. What it really is a sort of digital form of handcuffs. And it's not in commerce, it's everywhere. And that's not consent, not in any way that matters. I think that what we say, what we feel, what we believe, what the user, or more realistically, what the used want to see in the world, that matters too. That has to have weight. But increasingly doesn't. And that makes me wonder, how did we get here? The root of our problem, in my thinking, is that we put forward our sort of idea of what a country, what a nation, what a government should be in a particular way at a particular time. Government, the state, as it was envisioned, was to be a champion of the common weal, right? The good that we all benefit from. Wealth, of course, deriving from the other word, weal. But it's not about money, it's about more. It's about the welfare. And the welfare of the state is being made to replace, in the minds of many Americans and people around the world, regardless of language, regardless of nationality, the state, the welfare of the state replaces the welfare of the people. Our institutions, we are supposed to identify with, they are supposed to symbolize, they're supposed to represent us. But when they reach a certain level of complexity, when the members of these institutions begin to identify themselves as an internal and separate class, they become apart from us. They become less representative of us than ruling us. And I think this is not by accident. I think this is an intentional sort of act that's happened slowly, in part, almost by accident, by chance, by one and two, and then it infiltrates the thinking of a faction, and then it infiltrates sort of a caucus, and then it infiltrates a party. And then collectively, these parties work together to form that class, and that class takes control of the state, and that state takes control of everything. Because they slip sort of the leash that was supposed to hold them back, that was supposed to connect them to us. And our very language has been corrupted to suppress this understanding that the state works for, at the smallest level, the person, that the commonwealth, the common welfare, the sort of state of the nation is derived from the state of the person, of the individual. And yet, the idea that the personal, the individual, is what matters most is being corrupted and suppressed. And it is being replaced with the institutional. Now, merely suggesting this idea might bring to mind examples if you're thinking about our language and how it's changed, the way we talk about things. Public safety has been replaced, for example, by national security. How concern for the household income in political debate has given way to talk about gross domestic product in pages of The Economist. How the freedom of speech has become, for many, a thing to be feared, with the voice of the individual being degraded every night in every living room from the television set, as a poisonous well of disinformation rather than the cornerstone upon which this national project was founded. So as long as this passive strategy of enforcing popular submission to the institutional prerogative of the day is executed slowly enough to avoid alarm, we're doomed. That's the common narrative. That's what we're told, the boiling frog that we all know about. By the time anyone notices, to pick an example that couldn't possibly happen in the United States, militarized forces patrolling the domestic interior, our government buildings, for your safety, of course, the government will simply say that, of course they are. Isn't it obvious? It's normal. This is the way that they've always done it. This is the way it will always be. And don't get your history books out. Don't cite, what happened in the past to us. That's whataboutism. It is extreme. It is radical. It is non-normative to object to these long-established policies, right? Now take off your belt and shoes and walk through the scanner. This is not the way it always was. This is not the way it always has to be. But these things will not be changed for us. Progress is not granted to us. It's never a gift of history. It is something that is fought for. It is something that is won as a consequence of a long and painful struggle, often that involves a lot of sacrifice. When you look at our civic health today, I think you all feel something in the air. And you know, I'm not talking here about the civility discourse. I'm not talking about policing, you know, this or that way to talk to each other. That matters. We should be kind. You know, calling somebody by whatever they want to be called is, you know, that is a kindness, and it costs you nothing. You shouldn't be forced to do that. At the same time, there's no reason we should be willing to do it if we know better, right? Yeah. And yet, there's a new kind of language, a new national anthem that's being written around us that is not voluntary. It's one that's sung daily in the streets of every city, and we've all heard it, we've seen the videos. And the words are simple, you already know them. It's short, it's snappy, it's catchy, you'll never forget it. It goes, stop resisting. And I think there is no less American phrase in the English language. This chorus, delivered by that chorus, clad more frequently now in black, if you notice, than in blue, that I find the evidence of an effort to impose change on a national character that I do not remember from when I was young. Now, I was not the most politically aware kid. I'm still not, you know, sort of a professor of political theory. You guys can argue 71 different flavors of the non-aggression principle. But in the last 10 years, I have been told, in regard to what we could politely describe as a related topic, that people just don't care. You know, that's why things don't change. Yeah, their rights are being violated. Yeah, the government broke the law. Yeah, these guys are criminals. And yeah, they'll never see the inside of the courtroom, but they don't care. You know, nobody cares. That's a lie. It is a lie that we hear, and it is a lie that we tell ourselves to rationalize our lack of power, of agency, our lack of ability to resist, precisely in the manner that we're being told to stop even thinking about, stop conceptualizing as possible. Because we are, in fact, a nation born from an act of resistance. What the great institution of the Crown had called an act of treason. And each of us right now, observing the state of what is happening around us, to say that nobody cares, we are deceiving ourselves. I care. You care. And all of the people that you think don't care, they care too. And we care strongly. We simply believe that we don't have the power to change it, even though we know that we have the right to change it. What distinguishes, I think, the libertarian movement and party from sort of the binary super party is that whether we're looking at Republicans or Democrats on the north, south, east, west political compass, both red and blue have hopped in the caravan north. And they may differ on a few issues, but we all see that they vote in the same direction. Anytime there's a war bill that comes up, it's very clear where their true allegiance lies. They differ on some kinds of spending, they differ on some kinds of social policy. But when it comes to the idea that there are limits to what the government can do, they are very clearly in agreement that if it should be done and it can be done, it must be done. And that is un-American too. The new authoritarianism that is springing forth not just in the United States, but around the world quite clearly, is a response to a desire by those who have responsibility for what happens in the world, or at least believe themselves to have responsibility for what happens in the world, to respond to an increasingly complex world. And I go, well, we need new powers, we need new authorities. Like an author of a work of fiction, right? They want to be able to dictate what happens next. And we all know from the root of that word, it's a dangerous impulse, but it is a human one. We need to recognize that. Now, what so many of us have forgotten is that what makes the United States special is how strictly limited the government was intended to be. And I think that we're trying to persuade people who are not politically aware or engaged in the world as it changes. The power of the libertarian message is that it is different from the two other parties. It does not need to be extreme, but it is radical in the Latin sense of the word, the root there being radix, which of course means the root of the issue. Radicals are simply looking at the fundamental root cause of the problem, and that is that we have replaced a limited government with an unlimited government. Libertarians, as far as I can see, are the primary political movement around the world that are looking at what is happening and trying to do something fundamentally at the governmental level to correct for that impulse. I think a lot of us do not express enough sort of sympathy and understanding for where the error arises from those who are in power and going, we need to do whatever we can. But we should never compromise on recognizing that that is an error, and that even if we believe it helps in the moment, it harms in the longer term of history. That recognition that there is a limited government, and that is a good thing. And when the founders of the United States authored the Constitution, they made the work of government harder intentionally. They made the work of policing harder intentionally. They made the act of war harder intentionally. That was for a reason. We deserve a choice. We have to recognize the space for government. We need to recognize the space for policy. But we need to recognize that beyond that domain, when we move into the domain of rights, we can permit no trespass. That is an echo of the foundational myths of America. And that is a message that I think is owned by libertarians today. I don't want to go on forever. We should get some questions in. So I'll just conclude there and say thank you for listening and stay free.
Thank you so much, and everything you said, I could see the faces in the audience just lighting up because it resonated with them so strongly. They are here today because they feel so passionate about the party, and some individuals have submitted questions that I'm going to take the time to ask. Since
she has to click OK to continue.
Since your initial revelations, the world's eyes have opened to so many government abuses and overreach from the surveillance state. What is the single biggest thing you worry about that you feel the world is still asleep on?
It's exactly what I just described. It's the fact that what we're struggling with is not a party. What we're struggling with is not sort of a villain or a particular agency or anything like that. These all derive from the fantasy that if we stand up enough gates, we can control everything, right? This idea of national security, this idea that by knowing what people are saying, by seeing where people are going, by reading your web history, all of your message logs, right? Pulling out all of your sort of receipts, seeing the last place that you ate dinner and who you ate dinner with, which cell phone traveled with you as you went to and fro from here to there, that we know a person, that inference is the same as understanding. And look, I worked at the NSA. I was at the desk. I typed in XT score, which is just Google for spies. Everybody's communications are there. The government argues, even today, this is legal, because they say even though they're collecting them, they're not reading them, except sort of in certain ways. They redefine the word collection not to mean sort of grabbing it off the street, putting it on the shelf in the library, or even from your sort of cell phone tower you're connected to, or the Wi-Fi access point at Starbucks. That is not collection to them. That's some other term, ingestion, right? But that's interesting. It's evocative, sort of the metaphors, the language that government lawyers come up with to justify what they're doing that could not be justified under sort of the common language of law. They are consuming everything they can about every one of us. But why? Where did it come from? How is it justified? How is it possible? How does it continue? This was not legal. It was not legal before September 11th. It was not legal after September 11th. I would argue it's not legal today, even though they tried to pass some laws to do this. Every time a court has reviewed it, they've said it's constitutionally dubious, likely unconstitutional. It's a direct quote from one of the appeals courts in the United States. But the government knows as the case gets up to the Supreme Court, they just need to flush it, right? They abandon the case, they let sort of the plaintiffs or defendants win, and then they never get to that level of review. It's a smart strategy if you game the system, but even that is a small part of it. What we're talking about is that gamesmanship, the kind of lawyering that we all have engaged in at some sort of level or another, to try and understand the rules of the system, and then to exploit those systems, to hack them, right, for our own benefit. What has happened is the government of the United States has hacked the Constitution, but technology has hacked human nature. And I say that not just to describe what is being done to us, who are victimized by these systems every day, who are made to submit to these systems every day, to prove ourselves, to establish ourselves, to send a freaking tweet. I'm talking about the people who create these systems, who operate these systems, who continue to maintain these systems, who think it's a good idea, who release it out in the world and try it out. And then they see the consequences of it and they go, well, it works for me. And this is actually something that I think the libertarian audience needs to think about in a very serious philosophical way. There's this idea, right, that it's your property, it's yours, nobody can deal with it. This is the foundation of a free society, recognizing the individual. And this is important, right? I'm obviously not the guy who argues against privacy. And privacy is the foundation of private property. Again, these concepts that are codified in our language is something that belongs to you rather than belongs to society. But as we apply more and more levels of ownership to more and more sort of directions of the earth, once all the plots are purchased, once all of the means of production, right, are owned, and once, because of technology, human labor becomes of lesser and lesser marginal value, what happens to the people who come next? Are they counting on inheritance? What if someone is delivered by stork, fully grown, to this society? Well, now that private property right that deprives them of any ability to work, of any ability to exist, of any ability to engage in society, frankly, of any ability to survive meaningfully and participate in society, begins to itself look like a form of aggression. And I'm sure there are 5 of you in the audience that are right now opening your political philosophy book and sort of turning to the page that deals with this. But you should recognize that this is a real problem. It's no longer theoretical, and it's becoming more concrete in more lives. We have been, well, let's go to the next question, because otherwise I'll talk forever.
We could listen to you talk forever. We're really into this. So you gave up so much when you left the United States, and so there's been a lot of questions about your quality of life and how that's changed. And I was hoping that you would touch upon that a little bit, and also in relation to that, when a libertarian president does in fact pardon you, will you join the United States and come back to us again?
I'll be happy to. I've said since I left. I have one sort of demand, and that is that the government provide a fair trial. Now, the government strictly refuses to do this, and again, we've talked lawyer to lawyer about this. They're charging me under the Espionage Act, which is the same thing that they use against actual spies, but is used more frequently nowadays against journalists, against whistleblowers. I think under the Obama administration, he charged more people under the Espionage Act, more whistleblowers, more sources of journalism, and all other presidents combined. I'm not sure on the statistics that happened under Trump. I'm sure he would have been happy to break that record. Not sure if we were necessarily able to ride the roller skates to actually manage that one. But I think the impulse was still there. But the idea is, under this law, the Espionage Act, it's what's called a strict liability crime. That means the government will forbid the jury from evaluating any other factor rather than, did you do this? Motive doesn't matter, circumstances don't matter, what happened next, the consequences, none of that matters. Only, was classified information given to someone who is not authorized to receive it? That's you. You are not authorized to receive the fact that the government was spying on you, and of course everybody else. For that villainous crime, you go to jail for 10 years account, right? And they charge that per document. And there were many, many, many documents that were published. So I am in the running for the longest potential prison sentence probably in the history of the United States.
Yeah!
Through high school. Thank you. But look, the reality behind this is, can that be called a fair trial? Should the jury have at least the option to go, yes, this was a violation of the law, but it was justified. Yes, revealing this information may have been criminal under the laws as written, but what was revealed in these documents was that the government itself had violated the law. This brings us back to that non-aggression principle, right? You are not allowed to initiate aggression, but you are allowed to retaliate. If the government breaks the law to violate our sort of interests, are we then barred from responding in kind? That seems like a question that the jury would be qualified to consider, but the government, and this is successive administrations now, have said they will never permit that, because if they do that, they believe the government will be put on trial.
Yes.
And I think if they're afraid of that, that tells us everything.
Thank you. And are you concerned about your safety where you are at the moment?
No, I mean, look, no one is going to say that Russia is the greatest beacon of democracy in the world. Everybody sees what's going on. What I think people miss is that Russia is not alone. One of the very strange things about sort of being a former American intelligence officer that ends up as a stranger in a strange land is that, I've watched all the same films all of you guys have. One of the jokes that I told sort of a Russian guy out here that I knew was, it's funny how when you look at things from a global perspective, and the cultural perspective, the media perspective. Some of you guys in the audience, you play video games, right? When you play the early video games, there's only a couple bad guys that you don't have to narratively explain the reason for killing, right? You've got like bestial animals, you've got like zombies and robots, then you've got Nazis, and then you've got Russians. It has always been okay in the American public mind to see Russians as sort of the great evil in the world. And there are a lot of reasons to have problems with their political system, right? But it's strange, actually, comparing sort of the actions of the Russian government and the actions of the American government. People are worried about the militarism right now, which is actually very much mirrored and justified on precisely the same language, even the same phrases in the war speeches in Russian and things like that, that were used to justify sort of US incursions into Iraq. And I think it's sad to recognize what I thought was a uniquely Russian problem, a uniquely North Korean problem, Iranian problem, Chinese problem, is very much a global problem. When you look at all the bad guys from the headlines that you see as uniquely and distinctly, separately evil, you should really ask, why is it always the same ones? Why does it change? Like Venezuela, of course, is a classic case where they've been the great evil. And then Biden goes looking for oil, and they're like, hey, Venezuela's good again. We are being manipulated by narratives. It does not excuse the injustices and the violence and the violations of rights that are carried out by these other governments, right? But we need to realize that the problems that we are contending with are human problems. The things that you see Vladimir Putin doing are things that very much Donald Trump would like to do. When you see the things that are happening in China today, what you are seeing are things that will happen in the United States in 5 years, in 10 years, in 15 years, in 20 years. It may sound crazy, it may sound extremist, it may seem radical, but it's already happening. They are leading, the technological edge on things like facial recognition that are being rolled out around the world. It is being normalized. And when the Chinese, for example, show that these things are perhaps effective, even if they're not effective, if it could be argued to be effective, and it could be demonstrated to seem to be effective, it will become attractive. And I think nowhere has this been more clear in sort of the pandemic response. This audience may be familiar with it, but most people out in the mainstream are not familiar with it. There have been 26 million people in China, in Shanghai, that have been trapped in their city, more frequently than not in the last 2-3 months, trapped in their apartments, not able to leave. Sometimes even delivery services were canceled. And that is impossible for sort of the average American to imagine. And true, right now, it's impossible to implement. But it's not forever. We have seen in many liberal democracies in places like Europe, and even places like Japan, and especially in South Korea, an interest in experimenting with, adapting these similar methods. Not to the same extent, right? There's always an appearance or a desire to differentiate. But when we look back at all of this, we need to recognize that the fundamental argument is about what are the limits of what a government can do. Why you see Russia and China and whoever you don't like, whoever's in the headlines, sort of as the bad guy of the week, the current thing, when you see them acting badly, when you are chilled by them, when you are threatened by them, when you are being made to fear them, ask yourself, is the origin of this because that government appears to be acting without limit? And why is it then when we are not reacting the same when we see our government at home that we can influence, that we can change? Or if we can't, we must change. Why aren't we reacting the same way when it happens here at home? A government without limits is a threat to humanity. And the only one who can prevent that is you.
Mr. Snowden, thank you so much for the time that you've given the Libertarian Party this morning. We respect you so much, and thank you for all you did for the United States of America.
Thank you, everyone.
Be well and be free, Mr.